Hello, I'm Mike Bird, and welcome to another episode of the Nazareth, Nicaea podcast and vodcast, the show where we look at all things pertaining to the historical Jesus, the Christ of faith, and the emergence of early Christology. Today, my friends, you are in for a treat, because in this episode, I'm interviewing Professor Richard Bauckham. Yes, Richard Bauckham, the guy who wrote the terrific book, Jesus and the God of Israel, one of the best books on early Christology, one of the few groundbreaking books, or the books that really sets the agenda for the study of Jesus and early Christianity. And Richard Bauckham is a bit of a superstar. He's a bit of a luminary in biblical studies. He's done so many great works on the book of Revelation, 2 Peter, Jesus and the eyewitnesses, the Catholic letters, especially on the Gospel of John as well. Everything he writes is very informed, very well argued and reasoned, and very convincing. I mean, he's also one of the leading experts on the theology of the German theologian Jürgen Moltmann. And today I'll be talking to Bauckham about something in particular, and that's his new book, his forthcoming volume, which is about the Son of Man in the parables of 1 Enoch and in the Gospels. Now, this is exciting because Bauckham tells us that he has changed his mind on a couple of areas. So if you thought you already knew what Bauckham believes about the Son of Man figure in 1 Enoch, you're going to get a shock and maybe a bit of a surprise. And he's also going to say some things about the Son of Man in the Gospels that as well might be a little bit out of the ordinary. I mean, the Son of Man is a real mess and maze of problems and scholarship that you've got to work through. I mean, is it a title? Is it based on Daniel 7? Is it a Semitic idiom? What does it mean in Aramaic? I mean, it's a real nutty problem you've got to work through. But Bauckham's going to give us his take on what he thinks the Son of Man means on the lips of Jesus, and then he's going to talk about the parables of 1 Enoch. Now, these are texts that I've discussed before on this channel, and you'll get to hear more of them, this time from Professor Bauckham himself. So stay tuned, because this is really great. This is really good. It's probably one of the best interviews I think I've done so far. You're going to like this. So here it is, my interview with Professor Richard Bauckham on the Son of Man and 1 Enoch. Well, hello, Richard. Great to talk to you. You're there in Cambridge, and we understand you've been working on a new book to add to your collection of various volumes covering so many areas: apocalyptic Christianity, Revelation, 2 Peter, Jewish Christianity. But also you're now working on the Son of Man title, Jesus and Enoch from the book of Enoch. Now, the Son of Man, my understanding, Richard, this is like one of the biggest, hairiest areas of New Testament Christology, because you've got intertextual backgrounds, you've got the meaning of the Aramaic, then you've got what it means in the context of the Gospels, and they're all a little bit different. What's your understanding of the Son of Man title itself, Richard?
Well, first thing to say is I don't think it's a title. I don't think it's ever a title, either in the first book of Enoch or in the Gospels. In other words, the Son of Man, in the Gospels, stick with Jesus' usage for a moment. In the Gospels, the Son of Man doesn't really mean something. It's a means of referring to himself by Jesus. And of course, as you know, the Son of Man is simply a Semitic way of saying man. It's an ordinary sort of phrase, slightly poetic way of saying man. So, you know, in the Psalms, it's used in parallel, where you would need synonymous parallelism. What is man that you are mindful of him, and the Son of Man, and so on. It's just another way of saying man. So it's a very ordinary word in that sense. I think it's kind of elevated language, somewhat poetic, which Jesus, I think, uses as a way of referring to himself in the third person when he wants to speak about his mission and destiny. So that actually covers all of the Son of Man sayings. You know, people have wanted to divide the Son of Man sayings up into present sayings, suffering sayings, apocalyptic sayings, and it doesn't really work very well. And I think actually all you have to say is that they are all about his mission and destiny. It fits all of them. And you also then evade people have wanted to say, well, are they authentic, or is one of these three classes of them authentic and others not, and so on. I think on that sort of ground, there's no reason to think of them as other than authentic. So it's a way that Jesus wanted to speak about himself in the third person when he's talking about his mission and destiny, and it's the rhetorical effect of this third person statement, I think, that's the key. Because it's unlike a first-person statement in that it doesn't sound as though Jesus has just thought up this idea for himself and is claiming it for himself. It sounds like something that's being laid down for him. So I think that's the basic thing. And the key thing about the Son of Man sayings, which has led everybody astray, I think, is that the point of the Son of Man sayings is not really the phrase Son of Man. It's what they say about the Son of Man. And I mean, there's actually rather simple semantic fallacy that has trapped a lot of gospel scholarships. I'm not the first person to point this out. A lot of gospel scholars, have thought that somehow the Son of Man phrase has got to mean all the things that are said about the Son of Man. So Son of Man is a title for a figure that suffers and will come again at the end, and so forth. Whereas the Son of Man's title itself, I mean, I think you could paraphrase it as something like, this guy has got to suffer. I mean, it's not like that because it's not as colloquial as that. As I say, it's quite sort of elevated language, but that's the effect of it.
So if you're going to translate, I've seen a few different ways to translate it. I mean, you've got the Son of Man is normal, but I've seen translations as diverse as the Son of Adam, the human one, or could it be translated somewhat more blandly as simply the man?
Well, it could. It's just that I don't think we have in English a suitable phrase that means the man, but is kind of slightly more elevated language than ordinary, so that I think it probably, it has I think for listeners, it might have a kind of a scriptural feel to it, not referring to some specific passage of scripture, but just, it just gives Jesus is saying something very important and solemn. I think that's the impression. But I don't think we can really get anything better in English than the man. And I just use the Son of Man throughout the book because it's the familiar term, which everyone knows. But in the parables of Enoch, which is the other main document I discuss, it's interesting that the phrase translated Son of Man is actually always that Son of Man. It means you could translate it as that man. And so it's always referring back to Enoch's own vision, which is of the figure. Clearly, it's of the figure in Daniel 7. He has a vision in which he sees the two figures of the Ancient of Days and a human figure. And then every other reference in Enoch is really saying that man that I saw in the vision. So Enoch does not provide a basis for thinking that there was a Jewish title, Son of Man, that you could use outside that particular context in which he's referring back to a person that has been described and so forth.
Would that mean then that there's influence from Daniel 7 on the Enochic Son of Man, but not necessarily on the Son of Man tradition in the Gospels?
Yes, I think that's true. I mean, I think that undoubtedly in the parables of Enoch, Daniel plays a big role. The other thing, the book, by the way, is, I do a major study of the Messianic figure in the parables of Enoch. I think there's a more detailed discussion of that than anyone else has done. And then I also do a detailed study of other interpretations, other people interpreting Daniel 7 in the Second Temple period. And there's a lot new there, but that really hasn't been done in detail and with the same results as I come out with. But then, yes, I say that in the Gospels, I don't think I don't think the term means the figure in Daniel 7. Now, there are, of course, a few sayings, two sayings in Mark, which talk about the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven. And that's what you needed to say if you actually wanted to refer to the figure in Daniel 7:13. The phrase Son of Man is just not sufficient to do that. Whereas the phrase coming with the clouds of heaven, which occurs in the whole of the Hebrew Bible only in that verse of Daniel, is a phrase that points unmistakably, and that's why it's used, I think. It points unmistakably to the figure in Daniel 7. So in those sayings, yes, of course, Jesus is echoing Daniel 7, but I think only in those phrases, in only those two sayings, a few more in Matthew.
So we've got a poetic form of indirect self-reference that's designed to be oblique, to talk about Jesus's own mission and destiny. And that becomes, I guess, controversial because people have got a lot of things to say about Jesus, his somewhat scandalous behavior, his message, his sort of anti-priestly actions and symbols and sayings. So that's going to make the Son of Man a figure of notoriety. Well, I think that's very interesting. I think people will really appreciate thinking about the Son of Man or the Son of Man sayings in those ways. A lot of people want to make comparisons between the Enochic Son of Man. This is in the Similitudes or the parables of one Enoch in a central section. There's a whole thing called the Enoch Seminar, which I'm sure you're aware of, Richard, and they kind of do a lot of stuff with the Enochic literature, although they've kind of broken out these days into some other areas. They're now looking at Paul within Judaism and Acts within Judaism, but they do spend a lot of time in the Enochic literature. And very important for them seems to be an early dating for the parables of Enoch. Now, if my understanding is correct, just about every part of one Enoch is found in Qumran, including some other writings like the Book of Giants, but the parables of Enoch are not found at Qumran, which mean that they're the one part of one Enoch that may not be pre-70, may not be pre-Christian. When do you date the parables of one Enoch, or do you have any thoughts on their origins and their provenance?
Well, yeah, actually, this whole project started by engaging with that recent work on the parables of Enoch. There's an Enoch seminar volume, you probably know, which is entirely about the Son of Man issue. And then there's a subsequent volume edited by Jim Charlesworth that was sort of revising our view of the Son of Man, and Charlesworth's volume is very deliberately about this is relevant to understanding Jesus and the Gospels. Indeed, Charlesworth even suggests that Jesus must have known the parables of Enoch. So I started off by reacting with all that, and I think that one of the things I think is that at the end of the parables of Enoch, the Son of Man is identified as Enoch himself. And that's been highly controversial as to whether that's a later addition. I think that's original to the parables of Enoch. And the thing that emerges when you look at not only at the parables of Enoch, but also at other Jewish readings of Daniel 7, is that I think the standard Jewish way to understand who this figure is in Daniel 7, which of course was quite puzzling for Jewish exegete, tremendously important figure. Who is he? And I think as far as we know, they all thought this is a human figure, and it's someone who had lived on earth and was now in heaven, awaiting his central role in the events of the end time. So that for the parables of Enoch, it's Enoch. For the fourth Sibylline oracle, it's Joshua. For Ezra, it's a Davidic figure, not identified, but someone of the line of David in the past, now in heaven. For Rabbi Akiva, it's David himself, apparently. So the question, who was the Son of Man, is always answered, seems to me, not as some sort of heavenly being who's always been there in heaven, pre-existent or something like that, but precisely as the early Christians then themselves read Daniel 7 to mean Jesus as a human being who's now in heaven awaiting. So in a way that makes the early Christian reading of Daniel 7 quite coherent within the Jewish way of reading that chapter, but going for, as it were, a new option, a more convincing option in many ways, because they could tie it to other scriptures and so forth, as to who the Son of Man figure is. But I think that Jesus, in the sayings of Jesus, I think the reference to Daniel 7 appears only in those Son of Man sayings where he uses the phrase coming with the clouds of heaven, because that phrase is in the whole of the Hebrew Bible only in Daniel 7. It's if you want to make a clear reference to the figure in Daniel 7, you use that phrase. Son of Man is just not sufficient to carry an allusion to Daniel 7. It's too common a phrase, really. Could use it in all sorts of other ways.
Yeah, well, that's very insightful. It's very fascinating, because I know the Son of Man is a very enigmatic and debated figure. I know John Collins has popularized the idea that he's an angel. Morris Casey said, well, he's just a symbol for the people of God. He in Daniel 7, it is a peculiar figure because he seems to be sort of the divine archetype against the pagan beasts. He's also the one who's opposed to the arrogant horn that springs up. There is a parallel with the saints of the Most High, but then he's also got these qualities that do make him sound almost like an angelic figure of what you might find of one of the angels in the rest of the book. But you're saying that the tradition, the tendency of the Jewish tradition was to see the Son of Man figure as a human figure exalted to heaven and destined to play a part in some sort of eschatological act of deliverance in the future. So it wasn't so much of a shall we say, like a V shape coming from heaven to earth and back to heaven. It was more of like an upside down tick from earth to heaven and then back down, which obviously does make sense in the case of the parables as well.
And of course, just to come in on the angel thing, of course, a human being who has been taken up to heaven and glorified in heaven looks like an angel, So when Enoch sees the figure in Daniel 7, he looks both like a human being and like an angel. But that's because he's been glorified as a heavenly being. It doesn't mean he's substantially an angel, a non-human angel.
Which is kind of similar to Jesus in chapter 1 of Revelation. He's got certain angelic traits or visual characteristics indicative of things like Daniel 10 and the like. Well, that's exactly. It's interesting. Now, I know a lot of people have really been trying to push the influence of the Enochic parables on the New Testament, but Charles Worth on Jesus, perhaps, definitely on the Gospel of Matthew, particularly the scene of judgment, has naturally drawn comparisons, even on the Apostle Paul, and certainly in Revelation. Did you have a precise time when you think we should date the parables, or any thoughts on their provenance? What circles they moved from? Was it a priestly group, something along those lines?
I mean, the curious thing about the parables, of course, is not only is it not in Quran, which cannot prove that it wasn't written then. It probably means they weren't using it in Quran. You can't even be sure of that because, of course, we don't have a complete library. We have a lot of little fragments that we don't know what book they come from. But it wasn't found with the other Enoch fragments. We do know that the other components of the Book of Enoch did exist at that time and were read in Qumran. It's not the same for the parables. But of course, it could have been written in some other part of Palestine and used by other groups of people. Qumran didn't have everything that existed. So it doesn't prove the date, but of course, it doesn't provide the positive evidence of date that we have for the rest of the Book of Enoch. The problem of parables of Enoch, of course, is that it was written in Aramaic, translated into Greek, and then translated into Ethiopic. And all we have is the Ethiopic. Larry Hurtado always said he's not going to talk about the parables of Enoch at all because we don't know what it is. We don't know how well the text has been preserved. We can't use it. And my attitude is there were considerable problems. We frequently can't be sure of the text really, but we've got to just make the best of what we've got. with the proviso all the time, this is a translation of a translation. But it is striking, of course, that there were a couple of references in early Christian literature in the Fathers that may refer to the parables of Enoch, but nothing like the rather full documentation we have of the rest of the book of Enoch in the Fathers. So even if it was around, it was never very popular. And you can imagine that if a text that identifies the Son of Man with Enoch is not going to be popular with Christians who preserved, after all, most of the Jewish pseudepigrapha for us. It's only Qumran that's helped us out a bit with that now. So I think it was never a very widely evidenced book, widely used book. And nobody else seems to have taken up this idea of identifying Enoch with the Son of Man. It's just unique to the parables of Enoch. So it obviously didn't attract followers who wrote more literature. At any rate, we don't have that. Now, so I try to do most of the argument actually independently of the issue of date. And I have a chapter on Matthew and the parables of Enoch in which I show there is no evidence to show Matthew's dependence on the parables of Enoch, even if it was available at that time. My argument about date is that I do think it's very likely to be the end of the 1st century or possibly the very beginning of the 2nd century. Of course, if you date Matthew in the late 1st century, that doesn't quite rule out. And that's why I did the argument about Matthew, even leaving aside the question of date. But I certainly don't think the arguments for an earlier date, which Charlesworth and others are making very strongly at the moment, a sort of end of the 1st century BC or beginning of the 1st century BC, a sort of pre-Christian date. I don't think those arguments stand up. They really don't.
Yeah, I mean, the strongest argument I've seen for an early dating is it may refer to the Parthian invasion. With the something coming from the east, but the problem with that, and I read in one article, is that the danger of someone invading from the east can happen almost at any point in time. It doesn't just have to be the Parthian, sacking of Antioch and Jerusalem. There's a long history of worrying about people from the east coming in and raiding into your area, whether that's the Persians, the Parthians, the Sassanids. There's long history of worrying about what's happening over there beyond the Jordan and beyond the Euphrates. So, I mean, that's probably not even that is not a solid tag which you can tie the dating of the parables of 1 Enoch on.
And the closest literary parallel to that is in the book of Revelation, in the passage where the angel raises up the kings of the east and they cross the Euphrates. I mean, that's another example of how a standard kind of contemporary fear translates into a prophetic expectation. I
even saw that in the Dutch president, Abraham Kuyper. He played on that trope when the Japanese defeated the Russians in the Russian-Sino, Japanese Russo War. He was worried that this was the sign of the end times, that this was, Japan was the Eastern power that was going to rise up in the East, and their hordes of their forces would come rushing across, the plains of Eurasia and India. He was partly right about the rise of the Japanese Empire, but maybe wrong to insert it into a timeline in the Book of Revelation. But there we go. Well, I mean, when it comes to the Son of Man, I mean, it is quite, in terms of the history of religion, intertextuality, intermediary beings, the Son of Man is definitely an exceptional figure. There's several analogies with Jesus, in at least being a messianic figure, an exalted figure. He also receives a certain degree of worship as well. Now, Richard, you've argued that the Son of Man on a throne of the Head of Days or the Lord of Glory is something of an exception that proves the rule. And Larry Hurtado, now of blessed memory, kind of disputed you on that. He thought what the Son of Man receives is not divine worship; it's merely a form of obeisance. It's merely the form of the prostration of kings before this figure who's a divine representative to do judgment of of angels, but particularly more of a plenipotentiary on earth for the divine purpose. Do you have any thoughts on that, Richard? Are you still of the mind that this is definitely a form of divine worship, and this is one of the few places where an intermediary figure gets worship, or have you changed your mind on this?
I have radically changed my mind.
Oh, wow.
I've done a much more detailed study of this than I had done, when I wrote God Crucified, and I think a more detailed study than anyone has done. And I'm quite convinced that there are actually two thrones, that God has his own throne and the Son of Man figure has his own throne. And I also think that there is a very clear distinction between the worship of God, in which the Son of Man himself joins, as it happens. And the worship of God is always described in terms of hymns and blessing and verb. It's always verbal stuff that goes on in heaven. In the parables of Enoch, there is no obeisance to God in heaven. It doesn't happen. It only happens on earth. And it's only done by the kings of the earth, the mighty and the kings of the earth, when the rebellious forces are obliged at the end to submit both to God and to the Son of Man figure. So that sort of submission does take place both to God and to the Son of Man figure, but it's not divine worship. It's an act of political obeisance. And there are passages where the kings and the mighty worship God, but they do obeisance to the Son of Man. So I think there is a clear distinction, actually, that the use of the word worship actually is it can be very misleading. And in the Ethiopic and plausibly back into the Greek and Aramaic of the parables of Enoch, the word that is standardly translated worship in those contexts really does just mean bow down.
Proskynesis or something.
Yes, exactly.
Some Aramaic equivalent. Yeah, I mean,
exactly.
I'll set forth my idea, what I think is going on. Feel free to shoot me down if you like, Richard. What I notice is when the Son of Man is called a light to the nations, and the kings bow down to him, in my mind, that's straight out of Isaiah 42. Okay, yes. So that was, for my mind, that is the paradigm for the sort of the veneration of the Son of Man figure. He has this sort of Isaianic servant with a messianic bent and sort of some heavenly characteristics, but the obedience, the prostration he receives is similar to what the kings of the nations were going to do. I do wonder, though, can we completely distinguish a political and religious obedience? Because if kings are bound up with a kind of royal ideology of being divine representatives, can we really differentiate between a divine and a political obedience? Because even bowing down to a king who's appointed by God, who represents God, who is a son of Ra or whatever deity we're talking to, is that still in some sense a religious obedience?
Yes, I mean, I think, one always has to be very careful in the ancient world about saying this is political and not religious, because politics is religious. And there's a sense in which a purely human king, shall we say David himself, bowing down in obedience to David is religious in the sense that he's the monarch who's been appointed by God, but it doesn't mean that he is divine. Now, but the point you make, of course, is why Jews were quite touchy about bowing down before the kings of that period, the Second Temple period, when so many of them did in fact claim divinity. And for them, the act became ambiguous because it could be understood as. So in some contexts, it was fine. In other contexts, it was misleading, and they tried very hard not to do it. So it does have that ambiguity. But you see, I think in the parables of Enoch, it's like the example I gave of David. Yes, it's religious, of course, in the sense that the Son of Man is appointed by God to receive the obedience of the nations, as in Isaiah. But it doesn't mean that he is a divine figure. So I think there is a distinction of worship and obeisance. But your point about Isaiah is very important, because actually the figure of the Messianic, I call him the Messianic figure rather than Son of Man, because Enoch actually uses the term the chosen one just as often as he uses the Son of Man. And the chosen one comes from Isaiah. And actually just as much of the picture he paints of this figure comes from Isaiah as it does from Daniel. So it's a bit misleading to use the term Son of Man as though Daniel were, the all-important text. Isaiah is just as important, actually, in this. And there was the case you mentioned of the nations bowing down to the servant figure. Of course, later in Isaiah, they bow down to the nation of Israel itself. And there's a sense in which the Son of Man in Enoch represents the people of God. He's the chosen one, and they are called the chosen ones. So it is a bit like in Isaiah, the servant of the Lord represents Israel in the sense he can be called Israel. So he's also receiving the obedience of the nations that they owe to the people they're currently persecuting, but who really ought to be their overlords, as it were. But again, I don't think anyone reads Isaiah to mean that Israel is the divine figure because the nations bow down to them.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right, and that's what when as soon as I saw light to the nations and bow down, I remember thinking, well, this is just Isaiah stuff going on, with a few more trappings from Daniel and the like. Exactly. So, okay, well, that's very interesting, seeing how your own thinking has moved on from looking at this in further depth. Briefly, Richard, what would you say are the main similarities between the Enochic Son of Man and Christian presentations of Jesus? And what do you think are some of the main differences?
Of course, they're just such totally different figures, Enoch and Jesus. Apart from fulfilling this eschatological role, they are completely different. So it's interesting, you see, the use of Isaiah is quite significant in the book of parables, but the suffering passage in Isaiah 53, he has no allusions to at all. So he ignores that passage. And of course, that comes to the forefront in the Christian interpretation. So that in itself shows you what a different kind of figure, as it were, prior to ascension to heaven. But the other thing is that Enoch is taken up to heaven, of course, at the end of his life because he doesn't die. And he seems to, his presence in heaven doesn't really have any function. Except that he is known to the chosen ones on earth, so that he's their hope of deliverance at the end. He's their kind of, but he doesn't sit on the divine throne in heaven. He doesn't rule with God as Jesus does at the right hand of God. And I think that's a lot to do with the fact that for Christians, of course, Psalm 110 verse 1 was a key text here. And it's not, I think, alluded to in Enoch. But the other actually rather interesting thing, however, which people haven't made much of, it seems to me is very interesting, the future of the Son of Man himself in the book of parables, after the defeat of evil and the new creation and paradise, and the hope of the faithful is to be with the Son of Man in paradise. You don't often get that said of the Jewish Messiah. He doesn't have that sort of continuing role as some kind of companion in paradise. So there is a sort of connection there with how Christians thought of Jesus. But I think it's really the idea of a human figure in heaven coming at the end as judge and saviour that is the commonality, and that's what their reading of Daniel 7 has in common, I think.
So they're both kind of messianic judicial figures. in
Yes,
some
indeed.
sense, instruments for judgment. And I know the Enochic Son of Man, he obviously judges the kings of the earth. He also judges the angels. What I've always found perplexing about the Enoch Son of Man is his relationship to the angels. I got the impression that he almost inhabits a kind of separate jurisdiction. He doesn't have the angels toing and froing around him, sort of ministering. It's like he judges the angels, and then the Lord God himself, the head of days, then executes the final punishment on them. But he doesn't seem to be surrounded by an entourage of angels who do his bidding. And so does he have like a separate jurisdiction, his own little portfolio, and in a kind of heavenly hierarchy that just pertains to helping out the chosen ones on earth? Because I found it interesting that he does have some angelic characteristics, but he doesn't necessarily, and he does become angel-like in the final chapters. But I just found his relationship to the other angels to be incredibly ambiguous. Apart from judging some of the wicked angels, I couldn't really figure out much more of a relationship between them.
Well, he does actually. The first act of judgment is to test the angels in heaven, and they all pass the test. But he does actually begins his judgment with the angels in heaven, and then there are the kings and the mighty, and then probably the fallen angels. But there's a bit of text missing. It's very unfortunate there. But other sort of pointers to that suggest that there was a scene where the host of the fallen angels, the watchers in the Enoch tradition, who came down from heaven at the time of Enoch, are thrown into everlasting punishment. So there seems to be a three-stage judgment. But the angels, of course, the angels have their usual role of running the universe in Enoch, and the Son of Man has nothing to do with that. He really doesn't do anything in Enoch until he becomes the judge at the end. And he's not accompanied by angels. I mean, that's different from the portrait you get in Matthew, especially of the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven with the myriads of angels. So whether that's accidental, I mean, even in the Gospels, they only accompany him. They don't really do very much. Or they are sent out to gather the faithful, of course. But you in the Gospels, it's quite significant, especially in Matthew. The angels, when the Son of Man comes, are subject to him. They do his will. That doesn't happen in Enoch. But they're just not part of the picture at that stage.
Yeah. Well, probably a final question, Richard. Given your studies here on the Son of Man in the Gospels and in 1 Enoch, what are some assumptions in Enochic scholarship and in New Testament scholarship in the way that we use Enoch? What are some of the assumptions that you would like to see abolished or changes made in those two spheres of discourse?
I think that one of the things that I think is very clear is that far too much of this work has been pursued with a sort of Christological agenda. People are interested in finding precedent for New Testament Christology. And I do think in this and other cases of studying Jewish literature, that has to some extent distorted the reading of the Jewish literature. And I do think we have to put New Testament gospel stuff out of our minds when we're trying to understand the parables of Enoch. And then, of course, we can ask the question about how they relate. But I do think that the search for some kind of divine figure, pre-Christian, which can explain how the Christians ended up, in some sense, putting Jesus on the level of God, worshipped and all that sort of stuff. And in my view, even Larry Hurtado went too far with looking for precedents for Christology. I really don't think the early Christians were particularly influenced at all by any of those Jewish figures, who, after all, are not really that important in the whole scope of Second Temple Jewish literature. You've got the parables of Enoch, a text we don't even know who was using it or reading it at the time. You've got a few other, and these so-called intermediary figures. Usually, one of them crops up in only one Jewish work, and then another in another Jewish work. And Larry argues for this sort of pattern. But if you actually look at these figures, they're quite different, and they're usually unique to a particular Jew. And there's a lot of Jewish speculation around, and different authors came up with, but you don't find any of them in the great mass of Jewish literature from this period. So I think the role and importance of intermediary figures of this kind, the human and angelic ones, has been considerably exaggerated because people with an eye on the New Testament are looking for them.
Okay, so we should allow the one Enoch parables to be one Enoch, rather than assuming or looking for a missing Christological link explaining the origins of divine Christology, and simply treat them as these are medieval Ethiopic manuscripts that some have some prehistory and provenance, and not front load our conclusions by thinking in terms of the Christological questions and what they mean for Christian forms of devotion. Okay, well, I mean that sounds like a very, very sensible plan, allowing the Enochic parables to stand in their own right. So excellent. So Richard, this is part of a book that you have coming out within a year or so. Do you have a title for the book?
The provisional title is The Meanings of, quote, Son of Man, Enoch and Jesus. Okay, so this will be puts into the title, I think, what I'm arguing, which is really you shouldn't make too close a connection between the use of the phrase. Yeah. It's a very, very big book. I started with the parables of Enoch, and I expected to write a substantial essay on the parables of Enoch, and then a short section of implications for reading the Gospels. And the thing just grew and grew and grew. It's rather like Jesus and the Eyewitnesses, which started off as a short book and as it were, grew of its own accord. So this book has grown mostly during the pandemic, actually. It's a pandemic book. And it has just, so that I've written far more about the Gospels than I ever thought I intended to write. And that was the most difficult bit, the Gospels, actually, because all that material is so entangled in massive, complicated debates, that you have to find all. The Jewish literature is much easier because there isn't so much written about it. So it's a very long book, which I haven't quite finished, but I can see the end now. Probably 600 or 700 pages. So it's not quite of Tom Wright or Craig Keener proportions, but it's getting there.
Well, who does write books of Wright and Keener proportions for us lesser mortals? And do you have a publisher for it, Richard?
Yeah, so Erdmans are doing it, and they very nicely don't seem to mind how long it gets.
Oh, well, that's good to hear. That's good to hear. Well, the meanings of the Son of Man, Enoch on Jesus, that sounds like it's going to be a terrific book. Hopefully one that will shape the discussion of the Son of Man, which, as we heard, is not a title, and discussions of the Enochic parables in relation to early Christianity in the New Testament. Well, Richard, it is a pleasure talking to you. This has been very insightful for all things about Christology and ancient texts. Wishing you all good health in Cambridge in the UK and in all the rest of your activities to finish off the book. So thank you very much for joining me, Richard.
It's a pleasure. Thank you.
Well, that was a great show. I still feel a little bit giddy at being able to chat to Professor Bauckham about Christology. It's a lot of fun. And, we had a little bit of a chat, before and after the show. That was really good, really enjoyable. But if you can all do me a favor, if you can, take out a subscription to the channel. That way you won't miss out on anything. Feel free to, leave a comment, leave a question. I mean, if you've got a great knowledge of Ethiopic and there's something you'd like to add to the discussion, or maybe you've got just a general question. If there's anything I can answer, I'll try help you out as well. Otherwise, leave a rating and a review. And as a preview, in the next episode, I have another interview coming out with my good friend from the United Kingdom, Dr. James Crossley. Crossley and I go way back, sometimes crossing swords, sometimes agreeing on various things. But Professor James Crossley is a great scholar. He knows certainly about the history of the Bible in British scholarship. He knows a lot about the Gospels. He knows a lot about Christian origins. And Crossley has tried to set out a new agenda for what a fourth quest for the historical Jesus might look like. So don't miss out on that one, because that's going to be a great interview with myself and James Crossley talking about, well, what would a fourth quest? I mean, we've had a first, second, and a third. If we did a fourth quest for the historical Jesus, how should it be done? Okay, and what would be going on in the way that people did it? So all that to come on the next episode of Nazareth to Nicaea. Until then, take care and God bless you.